The first thing you need to understand about the Hall of Accord is that it was not built for comfort. It was built for scale. The kind of scale that made even ancient species, beings who had watched entire star systems form and collapse into silence, feel genuinely, uncomfortably small. The ceiling disappeared into a haze of pale blue light nearly a kilometer above the polished black floor. Gravity was carefully adjusted across the chamber so that every species, regardless of physiology, could occupy the same circular table without distress. The table itself stretched wide enough to seat over 100 delegations, each section subtly modified to accommodate different atmospheric needs, different biologies, different ways of existing in the same shared space. Some seats were filled with beings encased in transparent pressure shells, their bodies preserved against environments they were never meant to occupy. Others hovered instead of sitting, suspended in faint energy fields that hummed just at the edge of hearing. One delegation existed entirely as a cluster of shifting light, their form constantly reorganizing itself as they communicated, as if the very act of thinking had a physical shape they couldn't quite settle on. They had all gathered for one reason, and that reason stood at the center of the chamber. Ambassador Kelt of the Virex Dominion did not raise his voice when he spoke. He did not need to. His species had not evolved on a gentle world. Their voices carried naturally, low and resonant, designed by millions of years of harsh living to cut through storms, through seismic thunder, through the kind of noise that ended civilizations before they had a chance to become one. When he spoke, the chamber didn't just listen. It paid attention. He was tall by most standards, and his posture carried the unhurried certainty of a species that had never seriously lost anything it wanted. The species designated humanity, he said, his translator rendering each syllable precisely into the shared conclave language, has violated Virex territorial boundaries on 9 recorded occasions within the last 2 standard cycles. A display ignited above him. Lines of light traced star systems, trade corridors, and restricted zones across the chamber's upper air. Red points pulsed where the violations had occurred. 9 of them. 9 small, damning points of light. They have been warned, Kelt continued. Another layer of data appeared. Transmissions sent, notices filed, formal declarations issued through proper diplomatic channels. They have been instructed to withdraw. More data, more signals, more carefully worded messages that had been received, acknowledged, and apparently forgotten. They have not complied. He paused. Not for drama. Kelt was not a dramatic creature by nature. He paused because the silence that followed a carefully placed statement was sometimes more effective than the statement itself, and because he had learned, over 472 years of Dominion expansion, exactly how long to let weight sit before it became comfortable. 6 days ago, he said, a human vessel entered restricted space near the Halcyon corridor. The display shifted. A small ship appeared in the projection. Civilian classification. Cargo designation. The kind of vessel that moved goods between minor colony systems, crewed by people who got up in the morning, did their work, and went home. Unremarkable in every measurable way. It was destroyed. No one reacted immediately. In a room full of civilizations spanning thousands of years of history, the loss of a single cargo vessel, while formally regrettable, did not register as a tragedy. The conclave governed hundreds of civilizations across vast stretches of contested space. Incidents happened. Borders were enforced. People died at the edges of things. Kelt's gaze moved slowly across the chamber. His eyes were faceted, multi-angled, catching the blue ambient light and fracturing it into sharp reflections that made it difficult to tell exactly where he was looking. He did not look angry. He did not look uncertain. He looked inevitable, the way a geological force looks inevitable, not hostile, not cruel, simply beyond the realm of things that could be argued with. The Virex Dominion has expanded continuously for 472 standard years, he said. In that time, we have engaged in 31 recorded conflicts. The display shifted again. 31 symbols appeared above the chamber floor, each representing a war, a subjugation, a civilization that had stood in the Dominion's path and been made to move. 31 conflicts. 31 victories. We have not lost. That line settled into the room the way heavy objects settle, slowly, with finality, in a way that made the air feel different afterward. This was not arrogance. Arrogance implies the possibility of being wrong. This was history. Recorded, verified, peer-reviewed history. We are not here to request arbitration, Kelt continued. We are here to inform the conclave that the Virex Dominion is issuing a formal declaration of subjugation against the human species. This time, there was movement, small shifts, subtle changes in posture. A few delegations exchanged glances that crossed species and atmosphere and the 1,000 different ways beings communicated when they didn't want to be caught communicating. The reaction was not concern, not quite. It was something closer to interest. The mild, detached interest of witnesses to an outcome that was already decided. The humans will formally recognize Virex authority over the Halcyon Corridor, Kelt said. They will provide full compensation to the Dominion for 9 separate territorial violations, and they will acknowledge Virex sovereignty in all contested regions currently under dispute. The display above him dimmed. The red points faded. If they do not comply within 30 standard days. Another pause. This one sharper. The kind of pause that wasn't a rest, but a blade being drawn. We will proceed with full enforcement. Silence followed. Not the tense kind. Not the silence of a room holding its breath. The silence of a verdict being delivered in a case where the outcome was never seriously in question. The Virex Dominion did not make declarations it didn't intend to keep. Everyone in the chamber knew this. It was, arguably, one of the most consistently documented facts in conclave history. At the far edge of the chamber, in a section that had only been added to the circular table within the last standard decade, a section that still had a slightly provisional quality to it, as if the furniture hadn't fully decided to stay, a single seat remained still, smaller than the others, newer than the others. The designation plate in front of it read, Human Representative. Commander Elias Vance sat without moving. He had been still since the moment Kelt began speaking. Not the stillness of someone absorbing a shock, the stillness of someone who had already absorbed it some time ago, in private, and arrived here having already processed what it meant. No notes in front of him, no devices active, no visible reaction on his face. Just watching, just waiting. The conclave speaker, an ancient entity whose voice carried the accumulated authority of over 1,000 formal agreements, whose memory stretched back to the earliest days of the conclave's formation, shifted its attention slowly across the chamber until it reached the human section. Does the human delegation wish to respond? Every eye in the chamber turned. Some curious, some already composing their post-session analyses. Some, and this was the majority, already moving mentally past this moment to what would follow, because the answer to what came next seemed obvious to anyone paying attention. Elias Vance stood. He was not physically imposing. In a room that contained beings of extraordinary size, biological enhancement, and evolutionary advantage, he was small. Genuinely, visibly small. No armor. No environmental shielding. No visible technological augmentation. He looked like someone who had dressed practically for a long meeting and nothing more. He looked, in the most unguarded assessment, like exactly what he was. A human being standing in a room that did not need him to be there. He looked at Ambassador Kelt. Kelt looked back at him the way a storm regards a single structure standing in its path. Not with hatred, not with contempt, but with a kind of quiet certainty that the outcome had already been calculated and found to be beyond dispute. For a moment, Vance said nothing. Then, in a voice that did not rise, did not strain, and did not waver even slightly, the voice of someone who had made a decision before they walked into the room and saw no reason to revisit it, he spoke. We've received your message. A pause. Not long. Just enough. We'll respond. He sat down. And for the first time since the meeting began, for the first time in what felt like a very long time in that very ancient chamber, the silence changed. For 3 full seconds after Elias Vance returned to his seat, no one spoke. It was not the silence of tension. It was not the silence of a room processing something difficult. It was the silence of confusion, the specific, almost embarrassed confusion of a room that had been prepared for one type of response and received something that didn't fit any of the available categories. The conclave had witnessed thousands of territorial disputes, hundreds of declarations of force. It had seen civilizations beg, argue, threaten, negotiate, collapse, and occasionally, very occasionally, in exceptional circumstances, fight back. There was a rhythm to these things. A grammar that every spacefaring civilization eventually learned, because the alternative was learning it badly at a cost that could not be recovered. Threat, response, negotiation, or capitulation. Always one of those four. What had just happened was not any of them. The conclave speaker tilted slightly, processing. Clarification is requested. It said, with the careful neutrality of a body that had learned, over its long existence, that sometimes the most diplomatic thing you could say was precisely nothing. The human delegation's response appears incomplete. A faint ripple of sound moved through the chamber as translators calibrated tone and intent across species, across atmospheric differences, across the thousand small gaps between ways of understanding. All eyes returned to Vance. He did not stand again. He did not elaborate. He sat with his hands resting loosely on the table and looked forward, his expression containing nothing that could be easily categorized, and said nothing at all. The pause stretched. Then, from somewhere along the table, a sound broke it. Laughter. Quiet at first. Controlled. The sound of a single ambassador from the Kalari Trade Union, a being whose translucent skin shifted in faint waves of color that those who knew them could read the way others read faces, leaning toward its aid with an expression that translated, across species, as mild disbelief. "That is it murmured. "That is their response." The aide processed for a moment. "It appears so." "Efficient," the ambassador said dryly. Another laugh. Then another. The sound spread through the chamber like something releasing, not loud, not mocking in any overt way, but unmistakably dismissive. The specific register of laughter that a room produces when something has failed to meet expectations in a way that is more pitiable than threatening. Across the chamber, a cluster of gas-breathing delegates released a series of tonal clicks that their translators rendered, as accurately as translation allows, as mild amusement. A group of senior conclave observers made brief notations. Not about a confrontation, about an ending. The kind of ending that everyone had already expected, but that still required documentation. Ambassador Kelt did not laugh. He watched Vance for longer than was strictly necessary, his faceted eyes tracking something that his expression did not betray. There was nothing outwardly threatening about the human's response. No defiance, no challenge, no attempt at negotiation or delay. Just a two-sentence acknowledgement that contained, somehow, less information than silence would have. Not acceptance, Kelt thought. Something else. He turned his head slightly, a subtle motion that signaled to one of his aides. Data began to stream quietly across his personal interface. Behavioral models, species profiles, psychological assessments of civilizations under first contact with superior force. At the far side of the chamber, in the observation section reserved for civilizations with watcher status, a thin pale figure with elongated fingers sat apart from the group she nominally belonged to. Ambassador Lyr of the Thalen Observatory had not reacted to Vance's words. She had not laughed. She had not made a notation of outcome. She had, since the moment Vance stood, been watching him with an expression her aide had learned to recognize as the one she wore when she wasn't sure what she was looking at. She lowered her gaze now and made a small notation on a physical tablet, a habit most species had long abandoned as inefficient, but that Lyr maintained because she found that writing by hand slowed her thinking in useful ways. Her aide leaned closer. "Do you find this amusing?" "No," Lyr said. "Concerning?" Lyr paused, the stylus resting against the tablet without moving. "Incomplete," she replied. The conclave speaker allowed the current of quiet conversation to settle before continuing. "The Virex declaration has been formally recorded. The human delegation has acknowledged receipt. A response is expected within the designated time frame." A beat. "This session is concluded." The chamber began to shift. Delegates rose, hovered, or disengaged. Conversations sparked immediately, analytical, comparative, and in many cases already moving past the present moment to its implications for trade routes and resource allocation. The outcome, to almost everyone present, seemed obvious enough that it required no further discussion. The Virex Dominion did not make empty declarations. Humanity was new, untested, and visibly outmatched. These situations resolved in one way. As the chamber emptied, Elias Vance remained seated, not out of defiance, not out of hesitation, simply because he was not in a hurry, and because he had learned, over the course of a career spent in rooms where urgency was often deployed as a manipulation technique, to be suspicious of urgency. A figure approached from his left, a junior liaison assigned by the conclave to assist newer member species in navigating procedural requirements. The being's form was compact, covered in fine metallic filaments that shifted subtly with each movement, catching light in ways that seemed to serve some communicative function Vance had not yet fully decoded. "You are expected to submit a formal response within procedural guidelines," it said. "We will," Vance replied. The liaison paused. "The Dominion's terms are considered standard." "I'm sure they are." Another pause, longer this time. "You do understand the implications of noncompliance." Vance looked at the being for the first time, directly, and the liaison had the experience, rare enough to be memorable, a feeling that it was being assessed rather than addressed. "I do," Vance said. There was nothing in his expression. No bravado. No visible fear. No performed composure concealing something underneath. Just clarity. The expression of someone who had looked at a situation honestly and arrived at a decision they were at peace with. The liaison processed this for a moment, its filaments slowing. "Very well," it said finally, and withdrew. In a private corridor beyond the main chamber, Ambassador Kelt walked in silence beside his senior advisor. The walls were adaptive material that absorbed sound completely. No echoes, no external monitoring. The kind of privacy that was genuinely private rather than procedurally private. "Their response," the advisor said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone who had learned that precision was how you survive proximity to power, was not consistent with standard behavioral models. Kelt did not slow. "They are a minor species. Limited history. Limited exposure to conflict at this scale." "Yes," the advisor agreed. "However, they will comply," Kelt said. Not forcefully, not dismissively, simply as a statement of outcome. The advisor inclined his head. "As you say." Still, after a moment, "There is a supplemental file attached to their classification profile. A behavioral assessment conducted by the Thalen Observatory approximately 20 standard cycles ago." Kelt did not respond immediately. "Relevance? Unclear. It is flagged, but not integrated into the primary classification. The conclusions were considered speculative, non-aligned with established behavioral models," Kelt's advisor added carefully, "in ways that were not considered credible." Kelt continued walking. "Then it is not relevant." The advisor hesitated. "Of course." But he did not delete the reference when he returned to his station. He simply filed it further back, under a category he labeled low-confidence projections, and moved on to the work of preparation. On the opposite side of the station, in a section considerably less grand than the Hall of Accord, the human delegation prepared to depart. No large entourages. No ceremonial escorts. 3 people and a secured transport corridor. Vance stepped into the lift without speaking. One of his team members, a systems analyst named Riyas San, who had been with him long enough to know what his silences meant, waited until the door sealed before exhaling. "That went better than expected," she said. Vance glanced at her. "Did it?" She hesitated. "No," she admitted. "Not really." The lift began its descent. "They think we're going to fold," she said after a moment. "Yes. And we're not correcting that." "No." Riyas studied him. The easy posture, the forward gaze, the stillness that was not the stillness of someone suppressing something, but the stillness of someone who had arrived somewhere and stopped moving. She had seen people try to project that quality. This was not projected. "You're very calm about this," she said. "We've had the notice for 6 days," Vance said. "This wasn't new information." "That's not what I mean." "I know." The lift hummed softly as it passed through multiple security layers. After a moment, "So what happens now?" Vance's gaze shifted forward. "Now," he said, "we respond. Not louder, not sharper, just final." The word landing with the weight of something that had already been set in motion before the meeting started, before the declaration was filed, before any of the formal machinery of confrontation had been invoked. The lift doors opened. Without another word, the human delegation stepped out. By the time the conclave's internal summaries were distributed, a matter of hours, the human response had already been categorized. Non-escalatory acknowledgement. No immediate strategic concern. Filed, archived, deprioritized. Across the station, in observation lounges and private diplomatic suites, the same conclusions circulated in different forms. The humans would comply. They always did, these young species. They tested boundaries, misread signals, stepped past lines they hadn't yet learned to see. And then, when the consequences arrived with the weight of a civilization that had been winning for nearly 5 centuries, they learned. Usually quickly. In a high-tier analysis chamber overlooking the station's inner ring, a group of Pell Union observers reviewed the session, recording in silence. A senior analyst paused the playback at the moment Vance spoke. "We'll respond." He replayed it, then replayed it again. "Tone analysis?" he asked. A subordinate adjusted the filters. "Baseline human vocal pattern. No detectable stress elevation. No aggression markers. No submission markers. So, neutral." "Yes." A younger observer, less experienced in the formalized distance that senior analysts learned to maintain, tilted her head at the frozen image. "That doesn't feel neutral," she said. The room didn't respond immediately. The senior analyst glanced at her. "Clarify. He doesn't look like someone who just received a subjugation declaration from a dominant military power. He looks like someone who understands the situation," the analyst replied. "That's not what I mean," she said. "He looks like someone who expected it." A brief silence. "Expectation does not imply capability," the analyst said, and resumed playback. The note was not recorded. The observation was not filed. And in the margins of a document that would later be considered one of the most significant intelligence failures in Conclave history, it was never mentioned. In the Virex Dominion's command network, the human file was opened, not out of concern, but out of procedure. A junior intelligence officer named Terrell reviewed the compiled data at his console. Species, human. Homeworld, Earth. Time since first extra-system expansion, 94 standard years. He scrolled. Fleet capacity, limited. Primary vessel classification, cargo, exploration. Military adaptation, recent, incomplete. Anything interesting? Another officer asked, glancing over. Not particularly. Class 3 developing civilization. Meaning they're not ready for this. High probability of compliance, Terrell said. They've already acknowledged the declaration. Good. Terrell continued scrolling. Weapons systems, basic. Shielding, below conclave standard. Biology, fragile. No natural armor. No vacuum resistance. High environmental dependency. He paused briefly on a subsection labeled Behavioral Notes, Supplementary Appendix, noticed the flag marking it low confidence, and scrolled past it. On Earth, the message arrived without ceremony. No dramatic broadcast. No global interruption. Just a secure transmission routed directly to the United Earth Council in Geneva, received, authenticated, and projected onto the central table of a room with lower ceilings than the Hall of Accord, standard gravity, real walls, and a coffee machine in the corner that had been broken for 11 days. No one had fixed it. No one had noticed. The people in the room were reading. The Virex Declaration was displayed in full, then translated into multiple human languages, then summarized into operational terms by 3 separate analysts who each arrived at the same conclusions. No one spoke while it was being read. When it finished, the silence held. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of people processing information they had, on some level, been expecting. General Adrian Holt of Earth Defense sat at the far end of the table. He had the quiet manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where panic was a resource that got people killed and had learned to treat it accordingly. He placed both hands flat on the surface and looked up. Timeline. 30 days, the Secretary of State replied. Standard compliance window. Holt nodded once. Right. A map lit up across the table. Star systems, corridors, known Virex fleet positions. Red zones pulsed softly along routes the Dominion had been consolidating for decades. We've had preliminary models running since the first incursion, Holt said. 18 months of preparation. Update them with confirmed intent. Data shifted. Paths recalculated. Probabilities adjusted across 17 different engagement scenarios. Someone near the center of the table spoke. We should attempt negotiation. Holt didn't look at him. They didn't offer negotiation. That doesn't mean we shouldn't. Holt turned his head. They offered submission, he said. Do you believe accepting that ends this? No one answered. Holt looked around the table, at the faces of people who had been awake for a long time, who had been preparing for a long time, who had arrived at this moment having already made the calculations that most rooms had the luxury of making after the crisis arrived. Good, he said. He tapped the surface. The map zoomed in. We are not submitting. No emphasis. No raised voice. Not a declaration so much as a statement of fact, the way a navigator states a heading. Around the table, people nodded. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just acknowledgement. The long-range teams are in position, a technician said from the far end, glancing at a secondary display. All prepositioned assets confirmed. Holt looked at the map, at the Virex supply networks, at the routes they depended on, at the infrastructure that made a fleet of 700 ships something other than 700 very expensive pieces of metal floating in space. Good, he said again. The meeting continued. No public announcements were made. No broadcasts. No speeches. But across Earth, and far beyond it, systems that had been waiting quietly for this moment began to move. Not urgently. Not chaotically. According to plan. 3 days after the conclave session, Ambassador Kelt requested a full intelligence review. Not because he doubted the outcome. Because he did not tolerate gaps. His private office aboard the Virex command station was designed for efficiency. No ornament. No external view. Just layered data interfaces and controlled lighting calibrated to the precise spectrum his eyes processed most accurately. The human file opened in front of him. Species, human. Homeworld, Earth. Expansion period, 94 standard years. Fleet composition, minimal. Weapon systems, functional but outdated. Defensive capabilities, below Dominion standard. Assessment, low-threat developing civilization. He paused there. Not because the conclusion surprised him, but because it aligned too cleanly, the way a summary aligns when the person writing it has already decided what conclusion they want to reach. Expand, he said. The file unfolded. Historical conflicts, limited. Interspecies engagements, none of significance. Technological growth, rapid but uneven. Is there anything here that deviates from standard classification patterns? He asked. Across the room, his science officer, Relka, adjusted her display. There is one flagged section. Explain. It was not included in the primary summary. Why not? It was categorized as low-confidence analysis. Kelt's gaze shifted toward her. Show me. Relka hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied. A secondary document opened. Older formatting. Different authorship. Human Behavioral Assessment. Supplementary Appendix. Filed 20 standard cycles prior. Author, Thalen Observatory Xenopsychology Division. Why was this excluded? Kelt asked. The conclusions were considered non-aligned with established behavioral models. Relka answered carefully. They did not match expected responses for a species of this developmental classification. Continue. Relka highlighted the first section. Subject, human response under sustained existential threat. Observed pattern deviates significantly from standard sapient survival behavior. The majority of spacefaring species demonstrate de-escalation when confronted with overwhelming force. Withdrawal, negotiation, capitulation. These are the responses that evolutionary psychology predicts and that the data consistently supports. Humans do not consistently follow this pattern. Kelt read without interrupting. Instead of retreating or negotiating, humans exhibit a secondary response phase characterized by escalation. Resource allocation increases. Risk tolerance increases. Strategic creativity increases. The threshold for acceptable loss expands in ways that are not consistent with standard survival optimization. He frowned slightly. Increased risk tolerance under threat is not unusual. Yes, Relka agreed, but not to this degree. She advanced the document. Humans do not appear to possess a fixed psychological threshold for surrender. The behavioral limit, if present, is significantly higher than the conclave average, higher, in fact, than any species currently in the conclave's classification system. Kelt's expression did not change, but he slowed. When facing extinction-level scenarios, human decision-making shifts from preservation to resolution. This includes documented willingness to absorb catastrophic losses in exchange for long-term survival advantage. Losses that, by standard models, should trigger capitulation well before they are incurred. Relka watched him carefully. There is a warning marker attached. Display it. The screen shifted. Advisory classification, unpredictable escalation entity. Recommendation, avoid initiating conflicts that threaten species-level survival. Outcome projections become unreliable beyond this threshold. Standard compliance models do not apply. Silence filled the room. Kelt read the section again, then closed the file. That is speculative, he said. It is based on limited observational data, Relka said carefully. Humans have not been tested at this scale. Exactly. He stood. They are a young species. Limited experience. Limited exposure to real conflict at any meaningful scale. Yes. They have not fought a war against a superior force. No. Then this assessment is theoretical. Relka hesitated. Technically, yes. Kelt dismissed the appendix with a gesture. The main file reappeared, clean, predictable, aligned with every expectation he had walked into this office with. Prepare the formal notice. 30-day compliance window. It will be done. Relka did not reopen the appendix, but she did not delete it. She filed it carefully, in a location she could find again, and moved on. On the conclave station, in a quiet archive chamber far removed from the central corridors, Ambassador Lyr accessed the same document without being asked, which was precisely why she did it. The file opened instantly. No restrictions, no priority markers. Just an old document in a largely unvisited archive, sitting in the dark the way important things sometimes sit in the dark, not hidden, just waiting for someone who was looking for the right thing. She read it from the beginning, not skimming, not filtering for executive summary. Reading. Her aide stood behind her, silent, long enough to understand this was going to take a while. After several minutes, this was never circulated widely. No. Should it have been? Lyr did not answer immediately. She had reached the section marked Unpredictable Escalation Entity and stopped. Read it again. Then once more. They labeled it a warning, the aide said. Yes. And then disregarded it. Yes. Why? Lyr leaned back slightly. Because it does not fit the model. And if the model is wrong? Lyr closed the file. She sat still for a moment with her hands resting on the desk, looking at the space where the document had been. Then the warning is not the problem, she said. What is? The assumption that we understand what we are looking at. On Earth, the appendix existed as well. It was not hidden. It was not forgotten. It had been read, repeatedly, carefully, by the people who most needed to understand what it meant. In a secure facility beneath the United Earth Council, Dr. Malik Varma stood at the center of a room full of analysts and ran his fourth scenario review of the day. Update projections. Assume full Virex enforcement at day 30. Data cascaded across the displays. Fleet movements. Supply chains. Engagement probabilities. Casualty estimates. High. Very high. No one reacted. They had seen worse projections. Some of them had built the models that produced worse projections and had spent 18 months refining them until they had something that was not a prediction of inevitable defeat, but a map of how to survive something that looked like inevitable defeat. Overlay behavioral models, Malik said. Which set? All of them. The room shifted as multiple analytical frameworks layered over the projections. Standard conclave models. Historical human conflict models. Adaptive escalation patterns drawn from every major war in human history, cross-referenced with every available data point about how the Virex fought. A moment passed. One analyst frowned. These don't align. Of course they don't, Malik replied. That's the point. He stepped closer to the central display. Conclave models assume de-escalation under pressure. Human models assume adaptation under pressure. The Virex are operating on conclave assumptions about how we'll behave. Which one actually applies? The analyst asked. Malik looked at the projection, at the red zones, at the casualty estimates that were not going to be numbers on a screen, but people. Real, specific people who had names and families and plans for after. Both, he said, until they don't. Meaning? Malik exhaled slowly. Meaning the moment this crosses a certain threshold, he tapped the display, and the projections shifted to a secondary scenario, darker, wider in scope, stretching into territories that no one in the conclave had modeled. We stop behaving the way they expect. Silence. They don't see that coming, the analyst said. No, Malik replied. They don't. On the 14th day, the human fleet left. There was no announcement, no broadcast, no declaration of intent communicated through diplomatic channels. Just movement. 41 warships, 18 support vessels, and 4 carrier platforms departed the outer edge of Earth's defensive perimeter in the early hours of a morning that most of humanity slept through without knowing what was happening at the edge of the solar system. They accelerated into deep space on pre-calculated trajectories, running under communications silence, and did not look back. By conclave standards, this force was small. By Virex standards, it was, frankly, insufficient to merit significant attention. Observers noted the departure, logged it under active monitoring, low priority, and moved on. One Pell Union analyst filed a brief report. Human fleet mobilized. Size insufficient for sustained engagement. Estimated operational duration, less than 1 standard cycle. The report was acknowledged. No additional monitoring resources were assigned. At the edge of the Halcyon corridor, the Virex border fleet waited. 40 warships held position in a defensive formation that had been used, refined, and perfected over 472 years of successful operations. Precise spacing. Overlapping shield coverage. Firing arcs calculated down to the smallest margin of overlap. Every ship knew exactly where it was, exactly where every other ship was, and exactly what to do when contact occurred. It was a textbook formation. It was meant to be a textbook formation. Predictability, when you were the dominant force, was not a vulnerability, it was a statement. Fleet Commander Drax stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical display. The humans are approaching, his comms officer said. Distance. Closing. No deviation in trajectory. Drax studied the incoming signatures. Small. Disorganized by Dominion standards. Moving in a formation that a first-year tactical instructor would have marked as suboptimal. They are not attempting flanking maneuvers? He asked. No, Commander. No defensive spread? No. Drax's jaw tightened slightly with something that was not concern but was, perhaps, the early edge of something adjacent to it. They are inexperienced, he said. Maintain formation. Yes, Commander. On the human carrier Resolute, Admiral Elias Vance stood at the central command table. The tactical display showed him everything he needed to see. Enemy formation, distances, projected impact zones, the clean geometry of a force that had 131 consecutive conflicts and had no reason to expect a 32nd. Around him, his officers moved with quiet precision. No raised voices. No urgency. The specific controlled calm of people who had trained for this, who had run these scenarios enough times that the scenarios had stopped feeling like scenarios. Time to contact? Vance asked. 6 minutes, navigation replied. Understood. He looked at the formation again. 40 ships. Perfect alignment. Layered defenses. Every model in the Conclave's database said the same thing. Do not engage this directly. Vance nodded once. Good, he said. No one questioned it. Because they knew, all of them knew, that this was not the plan. The first shots were fired at extreme range. Virex long-distance batteries lit the dark, concentrated energy crossing the void in clean geometric lines that were almost beautiful if you could detach yourself from what they were. 2 human ships took direct hits. Shields flared, bright, violent, briefly visible even to naked eyes on the distant Conclave observation platforms. One ship dropped out of formation immediately, systems compromised, drifting. The other held for 3 seconds longer, then went dark. 2 losses, tactical reported. Vance didn't react. Continue. The remaining human ships did not slow. They accelerated. Straight toward the Virex line, without adjustment, without apparent strategy, as if the loss of 2 vessels was information they had received and decided not to act on. On the Virex flagship, Drax frowned. They're not adjusting. No, Commander. Why? No one answered, because the honest answer, that they didn't know, was not an answer that a Virex bridge crew volunteered. Increase fire output. Target central cluster. More beams. More impacts. Another human ship broke apart under sustained fire, debris scattering into the void in the silent, graceless way that destruction happens in space. Still the rest kept coming. Commander, formation integrity holding. They cannot close this distance at this rate. Maintain pressure. Drax watched the tactical display, and something in the back of his mind, something that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the part of tactical experience that lived below conscious analysis, began to notice that the pattern in front of him was slightly wrong in a way he couldn't yet name. On the Resolute, alarms sounded as another ship took critical damage. Vessel Ardent is going down, someone reported. Trajectory. Maintaining forward vector. Vance looked at the display. The dying ship's path cut through space in a specific direction, not directly into the Virex formation, but close. Very close. Close enough. Good, he said. And then, quietly, mark its path. A red line appeared on the display, cutting through a specific section of the Virex formation. Not through the center. Through the gap that would exist for approximately 4 seconds if the ships on the line's flanks moved to track the Ardent's final trajectory. Send it, Vance said. The human fleet hit the Virex line, not as a unified front, but as something that didn't have a name in the Dominion's tactical manuals. They broke apart, not collapsing, not scattering in panic, but fracturing deliberately, each piece finding a different angle, a different approach, driving into gaps that should not have existed and that existed only because the human ships had, for the last 4 minutes, been manufacturing them. Ships veered at sharp angles. They dove into spaces between firing arcs, forcing the Virex formation to track targets that refused to stay where the geometry said they should. Commander, they're inside our perimeter, an officer said. Realign sectors. Maintain structure. But structure required predictability. And the human fleet had stopped being predictable approximately 3 minutes ago. The battle stretched. Not minutes. Hours. By every projection in the Conclave's database, it should have ended quickly. Superior force. Superior firepower. Superior defensive capability. Every variable pointed toward the same outcome. It did not reach that outcome. Because the humans did not fight to win the way the Virex expected them to win. They fought to disrupt, to stretch, to pull a perfect system away from its own perfection and into the space where imperfection lives. Losses? Vance asked at hour 7. 5 ships destroyed. 2 more heavily damaged. Keep them in play. They won't survive another pass. I know. A pause. Use them. No one argued. Not because they didn't feel it. They felt it. The weight of that order, the specific heaviness of directing dying ships toward a purpose rather than away from danger, but because they understood what it meant and had agreed, before any of this began, to what winning would cost. The damaged ships pushed forward, not retreating, driving into the densest concentrations of Virex firepower, drawing targeting solutions, forcing movement. 3 were annihilated within seconds. But in those seconds, those specific, calculated seconds, they had forced small shifts, minor adjustments, tiny breaks in the perfect Virex line, and the rest of the human fleet was already moving through them. At the end of the 11th hour, the Virex fleet withdrew, not routed, not destroyed, no longer holding the line. Final counts transmitted across Conclave channels. Virex losses, 17 ships. Human losses, 11 ships. The reaction was immediate and quiet, too quiet. Because the numbers did not make sense. The differential should not have been this close. Not in first contact. Not against a fleet with 31 consecutive victories. Not against a species classified as a Class 3 developing civilization in their 94th year of expansion. In the Conclave Observation Chamber, analysts reviewed the engagement in silence. No species fights like this, one said. They shouldn't have survived first contact, another said. They not only survived, they held, a third replied. At the front of the room, Ambassador LYR watched the replay. Not the whole battle. Specific moments. The movements. The decisions. The pattern, or rather, the nature of the pattern's absence. They're not random, she said. No, her aide agreed. They're not structured either. LYR paused the image. They're adaptive, she said. A silence followed. Then, quietly, her aide said, Appendix 7. LYR nodded. Yes. In the Virex command station, the report reached Ambassador Kelt. He read it once, then again, then a third time. 17 ships, against a species that should not have been capable of sustained engagement. He closed the report slowly. Prepare the second response fleet, he said. No hesitation, no visible concern. But something had shifted. Not in his posture, not in his tone. In the space between certainty and calculation. A space that had not existed 3 days ago. Far from the battlefield, in a quiet room beneath Earth's surface, Dr. Malik Varma updated the projections. He adjusted one variable, then another, ran the model. The outcomes changed, not dramatically, but in the direction that mattered. He looked at the new model, then at the old one. And for the first time since the war had begun, since it had formally, officially begun, though in truth it had begun long before any declaration was filed. He allowed himself a small, quiet nod. Good, he said, because now they were behaving exactly as expected. The second battle came 8 days later. The Virex did not repeat their mistake. They had reviewed the engagement data, identified the vulnerabilities that had been exploited, and arrived at what their tactical models identified as a corrected approach. This time, they brought 80 ships, twice the force, twice the firepower, and a fundamentally different strategy. Fleet Commander Dunex did not form a line. He formed distance. The Virex fleet spread wide across the outer edge of the Halcyon corridor, maintaining separation beyond close-range engagement capability. Weapons systems calibrated for sustained long-distance strikes. No gaps, no openings, no close quarters where unconventional movement could manufacture opportunities. Maintain range, Dunex ordered. Do not allow them inside our perimeter. When the human fleet arrived, they found no line to break. Only space. And fire. The first volley hit before they fully entered engagement range. 3 human ships took immediate damage. One was destroyed outright. Another lost propulsion and began drifting. The third held, barely. Range disadvantage confirmed. Tactical reported aboard the Resolute. Vance nodded. Expected. Orders. He watched the display. The Virex formation wasn't rigid this time. It didn't need to be. It was designed to keep them out, and it was doing that effectively. Advance, Vance said. They moved forward. Again. Into fire. They're doing it again, a Virex officer said, almost disbelieving. Dunex adjusted targeting priorities without responding. Focus on forward elements. Break their approach. More fire. More impacts. Human ships began falling behind, damaged, slowing, struggling. From the outside, from the perspective of every observer watching through conclave feeds, it looked like collapse. It looked like what everyone had predicted would eventually happen if you hit something hard enough. On the Resolute, Ryasin stood at her station with her eyes moving across cascading damage reports. We can't sustain this, she said. Vance didn't look at her. I know. Then we need to pull back. Not yet. A pause. Admiral. Not yet. His voice didn't change. It ended the discussion not with force, but with the quality of someone who had already been through this conversation, had run it internally, had arrived at the other side of it, and had nothing more to add. The human fleet continued forward. Slower now. More fractured. More vulnerable. Exactly as it appeared. On Dunex's flagship, confidence had settled like ballast. They're losing cohesion, he said. Yes, Commander. Maintain pressure. A report came in. Human vessels attempting lateral movement. Minimal success. Ignore it, Dunex said. They're trying to reposition. They won't succeed. He was right. They weren't succeeding. They weren't supposed to. On the Resolute, Vance watched the forward group absorb another wave. Status. Severe losses in Group A. They won't hold much longer. Good. Riyadh turned toward him. This time, she didn't hide the reaction. Good. They're doing their job, Vance replied. A silence followed. Then, quietly, what job? Vance finally looked at her. Watch the backline, he said. Riyadh shifted her display and zoomed out. The main engagement filled the center, chaotic, destructive, drawing every targeting system, every tactical resource, every piece of Virex attention toward the forward group that was dying in the most visible way possible. But behind it, barely registering on standard sensor sweeps, were 3 small clusters of ships. Moving. Not forward. Not retreating. Sideways. Wide arcs. Slow. Deliberate. Running with minimal power signatures, just below the threshold that automated tracking systems were calibrated to flag as significant. She frowned. They're not engaged. No, Vance replied. They're not supposed to be. Back on the Virex flagship, Dunex leaned forward slightly. They're breaking, he said again. The data supported it. Human ships were falling. Formation degrading. No effective counter to sustained long-range pressure. Prepare advance. Close distance gradually. Maintain fire superiority. Yes, Commander. The Virex fleet began to move forward. Carefully. Confidently. Pressing the advantage. And in doing so, shifted. Not much. Just enough. On the Resolute, Vance nodded once. There it is. Mark it. A new set of vectors appeared on the display. 3 directions. 3 converging paths. The 3 clusters that had been invisible for the last 4 hours went dark on sensors, cutting power signatures to their minimum, disappearing from tracking displays. Execute. Hours passed. Human losses climbed. 2 carriers went silent. Entire sections of the fleet vanished from the tactical display. From every external perspective, this was the turning point, the moment the engagement reached its inevitable conclusion. Dunex sent the report. Enemy forces destabilizing. Collapse imminent. On the conclave feeds, the conclusion formed quickly. It's over. They pushed too far. On Earth, the same data arrived. And no one celebrated. Because they weren't looking at the same layer. Where are they now? Malik asked. Tracking lost on 3 clusters approximately 40 minutes ago. Good. Estimate re-entry points. The technician hesitated. They could come from anywhere. Malik nodded. Exactly. Back in the battle, Dunex gave the order. Advance fully. The Virex fleet surged forward, closing the distance, pressing the advantage. 700 kilometers of calculated approach, every variable accounted for. That was when the human fleet disappeared. Not entirely, just the part he could see. Commander, a Virex officer said slowly. Multiple new contacts detected. Where? The officer hesitated. Behind us. Dunex turned. The tactical display shifted. 3 new vectors. Converging. That's not possible. They never disengaged. They couldn't have. They did, Dunex said. His voice was quieter now. Sharper. Reorient fleet. Now. But reorientation takes time. And space. And structure. All 3 were already compromised. The human fleet returned, not as one force, but as 3. From 3 directions. At once. The Virex formation collapsed. Not because it was weak. It was not weak. It was the product of 472 years of military refinement. It collapsed because it was turned, stretched, pulled in directions it was not designed to handle. Because the humans had spent 14 hours manufacturing this exact moment and had been patient enough to wait for it. Close-range combat. Again, but on human terms. The battle did not last long after that. When the final reports were transmitted, the numbers were no longer confusing. They were alarming. Virex losses, 43 ships. Human losses, 19 ships. The conclave did not speak immediately, because this was no longer an anomaly. It was a pattern. In the observation chamber, Ambassador LYR stood without realizing it. Her eyes were fixed on the display. They let themselves break, her aide said quietly. No, LYR replied. They made it look like they were breaking. A pause. They pulled them forward. Out of position. Yes. The aide exhaled slowly. That's not adaptation. LYR didn't look away. No, she said. It's planning. In the Virex command station, Ambassador Kelt read the report once. Twice. 3 times. Then he opened the appendix again. For the first time, not as a curiosity, not as a formality, but as a reference. The shift came quietly. Not on a battlefield. Not in a command room. It came somewhere ordinary. Mira Station orbited a dim orange star on the edge of human-controlled space. It was not a military hub. It was not strategically significant. It was a colony, 200,000 people, engineers and farmers and teachers and families. People who had come out to the edge of things to build something that was not about power or expansion, but simply about living in a place that was theirs. The station rotated slowly. Hydroponic fields stretched along its inner rings, rows of green under controlled light. Children moved through the corridors with the easy confidence of those who had grown up among the stars, to whom the particular details of living in space, the hum of life support, the careful management of everything that came in and went out, were as natural as breathing. It was quiet, stable, alive. The first signs were small. A handful of people reported fatigue, then fever, then something worse. Within 3 days, the medical center was full. Within 5, it was overwhelmed. Dr. Elena Ionescu stood in the center of the emergency ward and looked at the latest scan with the expression of someone who had just recognized a thing they had been hoping not to recognize. This isn't natural, she said. No one argued. The pattern was too clean, too fast, too targeted to be anything that had emerged on its own. Sequence it again. We already did. Twice. Do it again. They did. The result didn't change. It's engineered, the technician said quietly. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she had already moved past the feeling and into the work. How long? Until system-wide spread. A pause. Hours. The station went into emergency lockdown. Too late. Across Mira, the infection moved through water systems, air circulation, contact. It was everywhere. In a small habitation unit near the outer ring, a boy named Tomas sat at a table watching his mother work. She was a systems engineer, not a doctor, not a soldier, just someone trying to keep the station running. Mom. She was reading, calculating, searching for something in the data that would give her a different answer. Mom. She turned. Are we going to be okay? The question hung in the air between them. Simple, honest, impossible to answer properly without lying or terrifying him. And she had decided, years ago, that she would not lie to him about things that mattered. She walked over and knelt in front of him. Outside the viewport, the orange star burned quietly, unchanged, indifferent, vast. I don't know yet, she said. Tomas nodded. He looked back at his homework, at the life that had been normal 3 days ago, and she understood, watching him, that the question had not been a request for reassurance. It had been a statement of trust. He was asking because he knew she would tell him the truth. 72 hours after the first confirmed deaths, the report went out from Earth, from the Center for Biological Defense. Short, precise, pathogen identified, genome fully sequenced, countermeasure developed, distribution in progress, outbreak contained. The conclave received the report and paused. That's not possible. It's not enough time. Not for full sequencing. Not for a counteragent. But the data was there. Verified. Confirmed by 3 independent analyses. On Mira Station, treatment began. Slow at first, then faster. The death rate stabilized. Then dropped. They were not saved. Too many had already died. Too many names that would be read at memorials and felt as permanent absences in the people who had known them. But they were no longer losing. On Earth, Malik read the second half of the report. The part not sent to the conclave. The part that stayed internal. Modified strain complete, a technician said. Stability confirmed. Deployment. A pause. Malik looked at the data, then shook his head. Hold. The technician blinked. Sir. Hold. We're not deploying it. We could end this faster. Yes, Malik replied. And start something we can't control. Something we can't take back. Silence. Understood. In the Conclave Medical Division, Dr. Saran read the leaked data twice, then a third time. They weaponized it, he said quietly. Ambassador LYR stood beside him. Yes. In 72 hours. Yes. Saran looked up. We have been studying Virex biological agents for decades, and they did this in 3 days. LYR shook her head slightly. They're disciplined, she said. That's worse. Yes, LYR said. It is. The Virex High Council received confirmation of the outbreak's containment. It failed. No, it succeeded. They adapted faster than projected. Then we escalate again. The target this time was not a colony, not infrastructure, not anything that could be framed as collateral. The Callisto was a generation ship. It carried 4,000 civilians between systems, families who had signed on for a crossing that would take years, that would end on a world they had never seen. Children who had been born aboard it and knew no other home. People moving toward futures that existed, for them, entirely in the abstract. It moved slowly, predictably. It was not armed. The Virex fleet intercepted it in open space. They knew what it was. They confirmed it. They fired anyway. The ship broke apart in silence. No distress call reached its destination. No survivors were recorded. On Earth, the notification arrived in a secure channel. No public broadcast. Not yet. Just data. Coordinates. Ship ID. Status. Destroyed. All hands lost. The room didn't react immediately. People read. Reread. Confirmed. Then someone sat down slowly. Someone else closed their eyes. No one raised their voice. General Holt stood at the center of the room. They knew what it was, someone said. Yes. They chose it. Yes. Why? Holt looked at the table, at the names that were not yet names, that were still a number, for 1,000, which would become names when the families were notified. To make a point, he said quietly. Silence. Did it? Holt didn't answer, because the answer was yes, and the answer was something that the room did not need to hear spoken aloud. The Callisto had been chosen because it was defenseless, because it was full of people who had nothing to do with the war, because destroying it sent a message that could not be misread. Comply, or there will be more of this. The message had been received. 48 hours later, every human fleet received the same update. No explanation. No briefing. Just a change. Operational designation updated. On every ship. Every carrier. Every command system. Remember Callisto. The message was not encrypted. Not hidden. It was broadcast openly, across all frequencies, in the shared conclave language and in every human language that had a translation protocol, so that nothing would be lost and nothing would need to be interpreted. The conclave heard it. The Virex heard it. Everyone heard it. No explanation followed. None was needed. In the conclave observation chamber, Sir Roland watched the update scroll across the screen. He had seen wars before. Many. He had seen the moment when a conflict shifted from strategic to something else, when the calculations changed because the thing being calculated was no longer purely tactical. He turned to Lyr. "They've made it personal," he said. Lyr didn't look away from the screen. "It already was," she said. "Now they've named it." Roland exhaled slowly. "What does that mean for what comes next?" Lyr's voice was quiet. "It means this doesn't end the way the Virex think it does." The conclave chamber was full. Not partially occupied, not casually attended. Full, every delegation present, every observer station active, standing space along the walls. Because something had changed, not just in the war, but in understanding. Ambassador Lyr of the Thalen Observatory stood at the center of the chamber alone. No projections yet, no data streams. Just her, and the silence of a room that finally understood it had been missing something important. "Before this conflict," she began, "the conclave operated on a shared assumption." Her voice was steady, measured. The voice of someone who had been building toward this moment for 20 standard cycles and had no interest in rushing now that it had arrived. "We believe that intelligent species, upon reaching interstellar capability, converged toward stability, toward preservation, toward the rational calculation that what exists is worth more than what might be gained by destroying it." A few subtle movements in the room. Agreement. Recognition. The comfortable nod of civilizations that had, over millennia, largely validated this belief. "We believe that war, while still possible, was limited, contained, predictable, manageable." She paused, and we built our models around that belief. She turned slightly, activating the display behind her. A timeline appeared, long, spanning thousands of years of conclave history. Across it were marked points, each one a conflict, a dispute, a war between civilizations. They were spaced apart, contained, short, each one a scar on an otherwise stable record. "This," she said, "is how most of us arrived here." She let the image settle. Then she changed it. The timeline shifted, compressed, densely packed, thousands of markers, closer together, overlapping in places, some periods nearly solid with conflict. Wars that had ended and begun again. Wars that had never fully ended. Wars being fought simultaneously across the same territories by civilizations that had been fighting so long that the original cause was no longer recoverable. "This," she said quietly, "is human history." The room stilled. For most of their existence, Lyr continued, humans were not the dominant species on their own world. A few delegates leaned forward. They were prey, hunted by creatures stronger, faster, more naturally equipped for survival. They lived on a world that was, by the standards of most inhabited planets, exceptionally hostile. Temperature extremes, seismic instability, high competition ecosystems, disease pressures that would have ended less adaptable species. She began to move slowly across the chamber. They survived without the biological advantages most species develop. No natural armor, no natural weapons, no inherent environmental resistance to the extremes of their own planet. Instead, they developed cognition, cooperation, the ability to pass information across generations, which meant that every individual human did not just carry what their own life had taught them, but everything that every human before them had learned and survived and written down. The display shifted. They also developed conflict with each other. The room remained silent, because the scale was becoming clear. Humans have spent thousands of years fighting each other. Not small conflicts. Not isolated disputes. She gestured toward the display. Large-scale wars. Multi-regional. Multi-generational. Repeated. Civilizations rising and collapsing and rising again from the wreckage of what came before. They developed weapons capable of destroying entire population centers. They used them. A pause. And then they continued. One ambassador spoke, unable to remain silent. They did this to themselves? Yes, repeatedly. A longer silence followed. And yet, Elwire continued. They did not collapse. She turned back to the display. They rebuilt. Again and again. Each time, they adapted. Each time, they extracted something useful from the destruction. New understanding, new technology, new strategies for how to survive. Their entire civilizational development is not a story of stability. It is a story of surviving their own worst impulses and building something better afterward. She looked around the room. This is the part that was recorded in Appendix 7 and dismissed. This is the part that every intelligence assessment filed, noted as speculative and deprioritized. A few delegates shifted at that. Recognition arriving in the specific form that it takes when something you should have seen becomes undeniable. When humans face manageable threats, Elwire said, they behave as expected. Caution, restraint, strategic limitation. The responses that game theory predicts. She tapped the display. But when they believe the threat is existential. She paused. The room leaned in. They change. The display went dark, then reappeared with a single line of text. Escalation phase. They do not de-escalate. They accelerate. Fear does not cause withdrawal. It causes focus. Loss does not reduce engagement. It increases commitment. The psychology shifts from survival to resolution. They simplify. Not their thinking, their priorities. An ambassador spoke, quieter this time. That is unstable. Elwire shook her head. No, it is consistent. It is the most consistent thing about them. She stepped forward slightly. You are not observing a breakdown in behavior. You are observing a different model of behavior. One that does not exist anywhere else in the Conclave's recorded history, because no other species in this chamber spent thousands of years fighting itself. She turned back to the room. The Virex Dominion expected a breaking point. They expected resistance to degrade over time, because that is what resistance does for every species in the Conclave's database. They expected loss to produce surrender. A pause. They are wrong. The room was completely still. There is no clear breaking point. There is only continuation until one side can no longer continue. She let that sit. I want to be precise, she said. Humans are not invulnerable. They can be defeated. They can be destroyed. These are facts, and I am not here to suggest otherwise. A small shift in the room. Relief. Familiar ground. But they cannot be predicted using our models once they enter escalation phase. And the Virex Dominion has already triggered it. Silence. Deep. The kind that comes when a conclusion arrives in a room that can no longer prevent what follows it. From the back of the chamber, Sir Roland spoke. If what you're saying is correct, what happens next? Elwire looked at him, then at the room. They continue, she said. They adapt. And eventually, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. They win. No one laughed. No one dismissed it. Because now, they had seen enough. And somewhere far from the chamber, deep within Virex command space, Ambassador Kelt stood alone, reading the same report. This time all of it, including the parts he had ignored. Including the parts his advisor had filed under low-confidence projections. He reached the section marked, Unpredictable Escalation Entity. And this time, he did not dismiss it. He read it slowly, carefully, completely. And when he finished, he closed the file and stood very still for a long moment with the specific stillness of someone reconsidering something they had been certain about. The Virex called it the final advance. 700 warships. Every available fleet. Every reserve unit. Every carrier platform capable of sustained combat operations across extended range. It was not subtle. It was not hidden. It was meant to be seen. Meant to be the kind of overwhelming force that ended arguments before they became battles, that communicated not just military capability, but the complete absence of doubt. Across the conclave, observers watched the fleet assemble. Lines of ships stretching across space, forming a mass so large that long-range sensors struggled to resolve it as individual vessels rather than a single continuous object. Fleet Admiral Heskin stood at the center of it. He was not a strategist. He was not cautious. He believed in numbers, in the clean, honest logic of sufficient force applied to a problem. 72 previous engagements. 72 victories. The record spoke for itself. 700 ships, he said. They cannot match this. On conclave observation feeds, the comparison was displayed in real time. Virex fleet, 712 warships. Human fleet, 163 warships, including Allied support. Sir Roland stared at the numbers. They can't win this. Beside him, Elwire didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the positioning, at the trajectories, at what the human fleet was doing, and, more importantly, what it was not doing. They're not trying to, she said. The human fleet moved to intercept, smaller, tighter, calmer than anything that number differential should have produced. On the carrier Resolute, Admiral Vance stood at the tactical display. Everything was in place, not recently arranged in response to the advance, not hurriedly assembled, placed, weeks ago, by people who had understood that this moment was coming and had been preparing for it with the quiet patience of those who plan in advance so they don't have to scramble in the moment. Positions confirmed. All units in alignment. Good. He didn't raise his voice. Begin Phase 1. The first contact was unexpectedly light. The human fleet engaged the front edge of the Virex formation, firing, maneuvering, then pulling back, then engaging again, then pulling back again. It looked, to every observer watching through conclave feeds, like a series of failed attempts to find a weakness in something that had no weakness. They're retreating, a Virex officer said. Heskin watched the display. Press forward. They're breaking. The Virex fleet advanced. Massive. Unstoppable. Pushing the human line backward, forward element by forward element, toward the edge of the Halcyon corridor. They're drawing them, Elwire said softly. Roland didn't respond. He was still watching the numbers. Hours passed. The pattern continued, human ships engaging briefly, then falling back. Always backward. Always toward the same region of space. The Virex fleet following, advancing, growing confident in the directional momentum of the engagement. Then a voice broke across the Virex bridge. Admiral, the supply network. Something in the tone changed the room before the content did. What about it? Heskin said. The display shifted and went dark. Not one station. Not two. All of them. 17 supply depots. 8 fuel relays. 4 ammunition platforms. Gone. Simultaneously. Not offline, disabled. The difference between a system that had failed and a system that had been taken apart from the inside. How long ago? Heskin demanded. The officer checked, then looked up with an expression that did not know what to do with itself. Months. 6 months ago, the Virex had been winning. 6 months ago, no human fleet had been anywhere near those systems. 6 months ago, the preparation for the final advance had been running smoothly, without complication, without any indication that anything was wrong. Or so they had believed. On the Resolute, Vance watched the confirmation. Supply network is down. Fully. He nodded once. Good. The Virex fleet kept moving forward. Because momentum does not stop instantly. Because 700 ships require fuel, require ammunition, require the supply infrastructure that had taken 6 months to quietly, systematically destroy, the infrastructure that was now, definitively, gone. They're cut off, Riyah said. Yes. How long do they have? 11 hours at current output. Then they start rationing. After that, they're dead in space. On the Virex flagship, Heskin understood. Stop advance. Reform lines. Pull back toward supply range. But pulling back requires time. And structure. And both were already compromised. Admiral. Multiple new contacts. Where? The answer came quietly. Everywhere. The trap closed. From the northern vector, the Dihul collective ships emerged. A civilization that had been quietly watching the war, silently calculating, and had been approached by a single human diplomat 6 weeks ago who had sat across a table from their council and made a simple argument. The Virex would not stop with humanity. They had not stopped with anyone. The Dihul collective had listened, had deliberated, and had decided. From the southern approach, a human strike group that had been running dark for 72 hours, silent and invisible, came online. From directly ahead, the retreating human fleet stopped, turned, and advanced. 3 directions. 1 target. The Virex fleet did not collapse. It fought, hard, disciplined, experienced, with the full weight of a civilization that had been winning wars for nearly 5 centuries and did not intend to stop now. But it was starving. Weapons cycled slower. Shields weakened. Coordination broke as relay systems failed. And the human fleet, and its allies, did not rush. They applied pressure. Constant. Measured. Unrelenting. The pressure of something that had planned this moment a long time ago and had no reason to hurry. 9 hours later, the Virex flagship went dark. 2 hours after that, what remained of the fleet transmitted a ceasefire signal. The final advance had ended. Not with annihilation. Not with the complete destruction of 712 warships and the tens of thousands of beings aboard them. With exhaustion. With the recognition, arriving late but arriving, that the battle was no longer winnable by any definition of winning that remained available. And in the silence that followed, the conclave understood something it had not understood before the war began. This had never been a battle. It had been a demonstration. The conclave chamber was full again, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. Admiral Elias Vance stood at the center of the room. No uniform decorations. No ceremony. A single sheet of data in his hand. The terms are as follows. His voice was steady, unchanged from the voice that had said, "In this same chamber, months ago, will respond. The Virex Dominion will withdraw from all contested territories. They will return all captured personnel within a period of 60 standard days. They will provide structured reparations over a period of 20 standard years, scaled to documented losses and displacement costs." A pause. The Dominion will remain intact. A small shift in the room. That had not been expected. Not after the final advance. Not after Callisto. Not after a bioweapon deployed against a civilian colony. No civilian populations will be targeted in the withdrawal process. No systemic dismantling of Virex infrastructure will occur. The Dominion's right to governance of its core territories is not under dispute. Another pause. That is all. He lowered the sheet and sat down. No applause. No celebration. The human delegation did not look victorious. They looked tired, the specific, quiet exhaustion of people who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had set it down, but whose bodies still remembered the weight. Across the chamber, the new Virex ambassador stood. Young, quiet, a diplomat rather than a soldier, brought in to manage an ending that the previous leadership had made necessary. He read the terms. Once, then again. Then he said, "The Dominion accepts." Just like that, it ended. Not with a final strike. Not with a moment of dramatic finality. With a decision, made by people in a room, in the presence of witnesses, in the full weight of everything that had happened to bring them here. In the days that followed, the conclave adjusted. Quietly, carefully. Files were updated. Classifications were revised. Assumptions were questioned in ways that had not been questioned before, because they had never needed to be. The human behavioral profile was expanded. Hundreds of pages added, battle data, strategic analysis, psychological observations from every xenopsychologist in the conclave who had been watching. At the very top of the file, a new header appeared, "Do not engage without full review." And beneath it, in smaller text, added by someone unknown, in the informal notation that appears in important documents when the person who added it didn't want to sign their name to it. "They warned you." You laughed. Months later, on a neutral world that had been designated as temporary settlement for displaced Virex civilians, people who had been moved by the withdrawal and had nowhere yet to go, a human aid worker named Lena knelt beside a small child in the afternoon light. The settlement was simple. Clean water, food, medical access, safety, the minimum baseline of things that people needed to continue being people. The child watched her with the careful attention of someone who had not yet decided what to make of her. "Why are you helping?" he asked. No accusation, just the direct, unfiltered curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that some questions were impolite. Lena thought for a moment, then said, "Because the war is over." The child frowned slightly. "But we were your enemy." "Yes." A pause. "But you're not now." The child considered that. "Your people died." Lena looked out across the settlement, at the people rebuilding in the way people rebuild when they have lost things, slowly, carefully, starting with what they can carry. "Yes," she said. "A lot of them." "Then why help us?" This time, she didn't answer immediately. She looked at the child, at the complete seriousness of the question, at the absence of manipulation in it, at the genuine need to understand. "Because surviving," she said, "was never just about winning." She stood, brushing dust from her hands. It was about what comes after. Around them, quietly, without announcement, that future was already being built. In small gestures. in the passing of food and water, in the particular silence of people who had been afraid and were no longer afraid, in the sound of children running between the temporary structures, indifferent to history in the way that children are, concerned only with the immediate joy of being alive and unconfined. It was not a triumphant ending. It did not feel like victory in any clean sense. It felt like the beginning of something harder and more important than the war had been. It felt like the work. And Lena, who had grown up hearing about the generation ship Callisto, who had known people who had been on the passenger list, who carried the weight of that name the way everyone in the human fleet carried it. Lena looked at the child who had asked her why and understood that the answer she had given was the truest one she had. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, just the decision, made consciously and repeatedly, that the future mattered more than the past. That was what it meant to survive. That was, in the end, what it had always meant.